What would you do if the person you loved online, the person you'd poured your heart out to for months, turned out to be someone you never expected? Imagine traveling over 7,000 miles, crossing oceans and continents with nothing but a picture and a promise, only to come face to face with a reality that shatters your entire world in an instant. This isn't a movie plot or a work of fiction. This is the true story of a young man, a long journey, and a secret that led to an unthinkable tragedy. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about love, trust, and the digital world we all inhabit. Before we get into today's story, which is a particularly dark and complex one, I just want to invite you to like this video and check to see if you're subscribed. Every like and subscription really helps the channel reach more people who are interested in these strange, dark, and mysterious stories, delivered in story format. Also, if you know someone who might be interested in this story, go ahead and share it with them. It really does help out the channel more than you know. So, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey that begins with hope and ends in horror. We're about to explore the case of Kevin Pratama and Naima Uka, a story that serves as a chilling reminder that behind every screen, there's a reality we might not be prepared for. We'll delve into the hopeful beginnings, the shocking discovery, and the 5 horrifying hours that followed. Our story begins in Jakarta, Indonesia, with a 29-year-old man named Kevin Pratama. By all accounts, Kevin was a pretty regular guy. He worked, he had friends, and like so many people his age, he was looking for a connection, for love. In the modern world, that search often leads us online, to the endless scroll of dating apps and social media profiles. It was in this digital sea of faces that Kevin found an anchor. Her name was Naima Uka, and she was, in his eyes, perfect. She was beautiful, with a captivating smile and eyes that seemed to hold a world of kindness. Their connection was immediate and electric. They started with simple messages, the kind of get-to-know-you chats that can either fizzle out in minutes or ignite into something more. For Kevin and Naima, it was a wildfire. They talked every day, their conversations stretching late into the night, bridging the thousands of miles between Indonesia and her home in Morocco. They shared their dreams, their fears, their daily routines. Kevin felt like he knew her better than anyone he'd ever met in person. He was falling in love. Not just with her pictures, but with the person he believed she was. Naima was just as smitten, or so it seemed. She told Kevin she was a successful businesswoman, independent and worldly. She sent him photos of herself in beautiful locations, living a life that was both glamorous and grounded. She spoke of wanting to settle down, of finding the right person to build a future with. To Kevin, it felt like fate. He had found his soulmate on the other side of the world. A woman who was not only his ideal in terms of looks, but also seemed to share his deepest values and aspirations for the future. After months of this intense online courtship, the next logical step was to meet. The digital world was no longer enough. They needed to close the distance, to see if the chemistry they had through a screen was just as powerful in real life. The excitement was almost unbearable for Kevin. He imagined holding her hand, hearing her laugh without the slight delay of a video call, and finally starting the life they had so often talked about. The plan was set. Kevin would make the monumental journey from Jakarta to Agadir, Morocco. He saved his money, booked his flights, and got his travel documents in order. It was a huge undertaking, a massive leap of faith based entirely on pixels and promises. His friends and family might have thought he was crazy, but Kevin was sure. He was so sure, in fact, that he packed his bags not just for a visit, but with the intention of proposing. He had a ring. He envisioned landing in Morocco, meeting the woman of his dreams and asking her to be his wife. This wasn't just a trip, it was the beginning of the rest of his life. The anticipation was a physical thing, a constant thrum of energy in his chest. He would daydream about their first meeting at the airport. Would she look exactly like her photos? Would their first hug feel as comforting as he imagined? He pictured their future together in vivid detail, a wedding, a home, a life built on the foundation of this incredible long-distance love story. He had no doubt, no inkling of suspicion. He was completely and utterly convinced that he was on his way to his happily ever after. As he told his family goodbye and boarded the first of several flights, his heart was full of hope. Every mile traveled was a mile closer to Naima. He was nervous, of course, but it was the good kind of nerves, the kind you feel before something amazing is about to happen. He had her picture saved on his phone, a smiling face that had become his guiding star. He looked at it one last time before takeoff, a silent promise that he was on his way. He had absolutely no idea that the woman in that picture wasn't the person he was about to meet. The journey itself was an epic undertaking. It was over 7,000 miles from Jakarta to Agadir, a grueling multi-leg flight that would take more than 24 hours. For Kevin, every moment spent in transit was a moment filled with escalating suspense. He was in a liminal space, suspended between the digital dream he had been living and the physical reality that was now just hours away. He passed the time by rereading their old messages, a digital archive of their love story, smiling at the inside jokes and heartfelt confessions. He imagined Naima on the other end, just as excited, just as nervous. He pictured her getting ready, maybe trying on different outfits, wondering what his first impression would be. He sent her updates from each layover, just landed in Dubai, getting closer. Each message was a breadcrumb on his trail to her, a way of making her part of the journey. He was closing the gap, one flight at a time, and the emotional stakes felt incredibly high. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a life-altering pilgrimage. As the final leg of his flight began its descent into Agadir, the reality of the situation began to truly set in. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment he had dreamed of for months was finally here. He smoothed down his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and rehearsed his first words to her in his head. He felt a potent mix of euphoria and sheer terror. What if he was awkward? What if there was a moment of silence? He pushed the doubts aside. This was Naima. It would be perfect. He stepped off the plane and into the warm Moroccan air, a world away from the humid bustle of Jakarta. The airport was a flurry of activity, with families reuniting and travelers rushing to their destinations. Kevin scanned the crowd in the arrivals hall, his eyes searching desperately for the familiar face from his phone screen. He held his luggage trolley in a white-knuckled grip, his gaze darting from person to person. He had told her he'd be wearing a blue jacket. He stood out, he hoped. He walked slowly through the terminal, his eyes wide. Every woman with dark hair made his heart leap. He pulled out his phone, looking at her picture again, memorizing her features one last time, comparing the digital image to the sea of real faces before him. Where was she? A small seed of anxiety began to sprout in his chest. Maybe she was running late, stuck in traffic. He sent her a quick message. "I've landed. I'm in the arrivals hall. Where are you?" He waited. 1 minute turned into 5, then 10. The crowd in the arrivals hall began to thin out. The joyful reunions had mostly dispersed, leaving behind the stragglers and the taxi drivers. The anxiety was no longer a seed, it was a thorny vine wrapping around his lungs. He called her, no answer. He called again, straight to voicemail. Panic began to bubble up, hot and acidic. Had he come all this way for nothing? Was this some cruel joke? Just as true despair was about to set in, his phone buzzed. It was a message, not from Naima, but from an unknown number. It read, "Look for the woman in the black niqab holding a sign with your name on it." A niqab? Naima had never mentioned wearing one. In all her pictures, her face was uncovered. Confusion warred with relief. At least someone was here for him. He scanned the remaining people in the hall, and then he saw it. A small sign with Kevin written on it, held by a woman whose entire face, except for her eyes, was covered by a black veil. This had to be her. Kevin felt a wave of relief wash over him, quickly followed by a fresh wave of confusion. The niqab was unexpected, but he tried to rationalize it. Maybe, he thought, it was a cultural or religious custom she hadn't felt the need to mention over their calls. Or perhaps she was just shy about meeting him in such a crowded public place. He pushed his cart towards the woman, his heart starting to race again, this time with a strange mix of excitement and unease. As he got closer, he tried to catch her eye, searching for that recognition, that love he was expecting. "Naima?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. The woman nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes, the only part of her visible, seemed to hold a deep sadness. They just weren't the bright, smiling eyes from the photographs. Something felt wrong, and the air was thick with a tension he couldn't quite name. He tried to smile, hoping to break the awkwardness. "It's so good to finally meet you," he said, his voice trailing off, as he glanced from her veiled face to the sign she was holding. It was her. It had to be. She gestured for him to follow, and they walked in silence out of the airport and to a waiting car. The silence was, honestly, deafening. All those months of constant conversation, laughter, and shared secrets had just evaporated into this heavy, uncomfortable quiet. Kevin tried to make small talk, asking about her day, about the drive to the airport, but he was met with only nods and quiet, one-word answers from behind the veil. The unease in his gut was growing into full-blown alarm. This wasn't the reunion he had fantasized about. They arrived at a small, modest apartment. This, too, was a surprise. The glamorous businesswoman he had spoken to seemed to live a life far removed from this simple dwelling. But again, he tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe this was just a temporary place. Maybe she was just more humble in person. He was grasping at straws, trying desperately to hold on to the image of the woman he had flown 7,000 miles to marry. He followed her inside, his suitcase rolling loudly behind him on the tile floor. Inside the apartment, she closed the door behind them. They stood in the small living room, the silence stretching between them. Can I see you?" Kevin finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. He needed to see her face. He needed the reassurance of seeing the woman from the pictures. After a long, agonizing pause, the woman slowly reached up with trembling hands and lifted the niqab from her face, and in that moment, Kevin Pratima's world fell apart. The woman standing before him was not the woman from the pictures, not even close. While the pictures showed a conventionally beautiful woman in her late 20s, the person in front of him was someone else entirely. It was Naima Oka, but she was a woman who had Down syndrome. The shock was a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs and sent his mind reeling. He stared at her, his brain unable to process the disparity between the reality in front of him and the fantasy he had held onto for so long. He felt a cascade of emotions, utter shock, profound confusion, and a deep, sinking feeling of betrayal. This was a catfish, but on a level he could never have imagined. It wasn't just a few filtered photos or a little white lie about her age. This was a fundamental deception about her identity. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had planned to propose to, did not exist. In her place was a stranger, a vulnerable woman, who was now looking at him with fear and desperation in her eyes. The dream was over. The nightmare had just begun. The immediate aftermath of the reveal was pure chaos, at least inside Kevin's head. He stumbled back, physically recoiling from the shock. He couldn't speak. He just stared, trying to reconcile the two Naimas. The Naima from the internet, witty and successful, the woman on his phone's lock screen, and the Naima in front of him, a woman who was clearly not the person she had pretended to be. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. He had been lied to. He had been made a fool of. He had spent his life savings to fly across the world for a lie. Naima, seeing the look on his face, began to cry. Through her tears, the full story started to come out, pieced together in broken sentences. The pictures she had used were not of her. They belonged to someone else. She'd created a fantasy persona online because she was lonely and feared no one would love her for who she truly was. She had fallen for Kevin, for the connection they had, and had become trapped in her own deception, hoping that when he met her in person, he would be able to see past it and love the real her. But Kevin wasn't capable of seeing past it. The betrayal was too deep, the shock too profound. He felt trapped. He was in a foreign country, in a stranger's apartment, with no money for a return flight and no one to turn to. The dream of a wedding and a happy future was replaced by the cold, harsh reality of his situation. He began to pace the small apartment like a caged animal, his mind racing. He demanded to know who the woman in the photos was. He demanded answers. His anger and panic escalated with every passing moment. The hours that followed were a pressure cooker of emotion. Kevin's initial shock morphed into a desperate, frantic rage. He felt utterly humiliated. He had told his friends and family he was going to Morocco to get married. How could he go back? How could he face them and admit he had been the victim of such an elaborate catfish? The shame was suffocating. He yelled at Naima, his voice echoing in the small apartment. He accused her of ruining his life. Naima, in turn, was terrified, her desperate hope for acceptance curdling into fear. The situation grew more and more volatile. Kevin felt his control slipping. He was thousands of miles from home, broke and emotionally shattered. In his mind, Naima was the sole cause of this unbearable situation. She was the one who had lied, who had lured him here under false pretenses. The tension in the room became unbearable. It was a toxic mix of his rage and her fear. He wasn't thinking rationally anymore. He was operating on pure, raw emotion, humiliation, fury, and a profound sense of injustice. What happened next is the dark heart of this story. The argument escalated from verbal to physical. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, fueled by the crushing weight of his shattered dreams and public humiliation, Kevin attacked Naima. The violence was sudden and brutal. It was the tragic culmination of a deception that had spiraled out of control, a fantasy that had collided with reality in the most horrific way possible. The person he thought he loved was a phantom, and the person who stood in her place became the sole focus of his devastating rage. Just 5 hours after he had stepped off the plane, filled with hope and love, Kevin Pratama became a killer. In that small Agadir apartment, the digital love story reached its horrifying conclusion. Naima Uka, the woman who had created a fantasy to find love, lay dead, and Kevin, the man who had traveled the world for that fantasy, was left to face the catastrophic consequences of his actions. His proposal ring still unused in his suitcase. The dream had ended in blood. The immediate aftermath was eerily quiet. The rage subsided, leaving Kevin alone in the apartment with the horrifying reality of what he had done. The panic returned, but it was a different kind now, cold and sharp. He had just taken a human life. His future, which just hours ago had seemed so bright, was now a black hole. He was a fugitive in a foreign country. His first instinct was to run. He grabbed his belongings and fled the apartment, leaving Naima behind. His escape was clumsy and short-lived. He didn't know the city, didn't speak the language well, and, honestly, he stood out. It wasn't long before Moroccan authorities, alerted by neighbors who had heard the violent argument, found Naima's body. An immediate manhunt was launched for the foreign visitor she was supposed to meet at the airport. Security footage from the airport and witness descriptions quickly led police directly to Kevin. He was apprehended shortly after, his desperate flight from justice coming to an abrupt end. In custody, Kevin confessed to everything. He recounted the entire story, the online romance, the long journey, the shocking reveal, and the uncontrollable rage that led him to kill Naima. His defense was one of complete emotional breakdown. He claimed he had been driven to a state of temporary insanity by the profound deception and the humiliation he felt. He painted himself as the victim of a cruel and elaborate lie, a man whose mind had snapped under the immense pressure of the situation. The case became a media sensation, both in Morocco and internationally. It was a story that touched on so many modern anxieties, The dangers of online dating, the nature of identity in the digital age, and the fine line between love and obsession. People were divided. Some saw Kevin as a cold-blooded killer who took his anger out on a vulnerable woman. They argued that no matter the deception, it could never justify murder. His actions were his own, and he had to be held accountable for them. Others, however, felt a degree of sympathy for Kevin. They saw him as a tragic figure, a man who was profoundly wronged and who acted out of a temporary loss of control. They didn't condone his actions, but they understood the immense psychological shock he must have experienced. They pointed to Naima's deception as the catalyst, arguing that while she didn't deserve to die, she was not an innocent party. This perspective viewed the tragedy as a complex situation, with fault on both sides. The court ultimately had to decide, was Kevin Pratama a victim who snapped, or a murderer who refused to take responsibility for his own rage? The legal system in Morocco found him guilty. The deception he experienced was considered a mitigating factor, but it did not absolve him of the crime of murder. He was sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life in prison. He remains incarcerated in Morocco, a world away from his home, his life irrevocably destroyed by a love that was never real. And this brings us to the central, haunting question of this entire story. Why did this happen? Was it simply a case of a man with a violent temper who was pushed too far? Or is there something deeper here, something about the nature of the online worlds we build? We create idealized versions of ourselves and fall in love with idealized versions of others. But what happens when those digital ghosts are forced into the harsh light of reality? Kevin and Naima's story is a tragic, extreme example, but it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the illusions we chase and the truths we can't handle. The story of Kevin Pratama and Naima Uka is a tragedy in every sense of the word. Two lives were destroyed, one taken and the other condemned to a life behind bars, all because of a fantasy spun from loneliness and deception. It serves as one of the darkest cautionary tales for the age of online dating. It highlights the immense gap that can exist between a person's digital avatar and their real-world self, and the devastating consequences that can occur when that gap is revealed. Naima's lie was born from a place of insecurity and a desire for connection, but it set in motion a chain of events that ended in the worst possible way. This case forces us to look at our own online interactions and the expectations we build around people we've never met. We fall in love with curated profiles, with carefully selected photos and well-crafted words, but we can never truly know the person on the other side of the screen until we are face to face. Kevin's rage, while inexcusable and horrific in its outcome, came from a place of profound psychological shock and humiliation. The person he had invested all his hopes, dreams, and savings into simply did not exist. It's a story with no winners, only loss and sorrow. What would you have done in his place? Not in the final, violent moments, but in that first instant of shocking realization. How would you have reacted? It's a question that's difficult to answer, honestly. Let me know your thoughts on this incredibly complex and tragic case in the comments below. It's a